Hello to the boys, gals, and non-binary pals. My name is Leanne, and today I am going to be wrapping up everything that I read in November. So these are going to be little mini reviews of the 8 books that I read in November. November was a non-fiction November, of course. If you want to hear what I was supposed to read during the month, I will leave my TBR video linked. I did read some of the books that were on my TBR. The ones that I didn't get around to reading, I will be rolling on to try and read them in December because they were books that I was really keen to get to. But half of my reading in November was non-fiction, so 4 books, 50%. And while we're chatting non-fiction, let's start with those. These are the 4 non-fiction books that I read in November, starting with Gather Together in My Name by Maya Angelou. This is Maya Angelou's second memoir. I read her first one, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, a couple of years ago, and I really enjoyed it. I guess maybe enjoyed is the wrong word, but I appreciated it. Her first memoir is definitely her most kind of well-known and most widely read and most widely quoted one. But having read this, I'm definitely keen to read her third memoir, which is already on my shelf. I'll probably be reading that in December if I can get round to it, because it is both one of the books that have been on my TBR for the longest, and I wanted to read those books before the end of the year. But it's also called Singing and Swinging and Getting Merry Like Christmas, so, you know, Christmas. And I'd definitely be keen to read her later memoirs as well, so all 6 of them, and I really want to collect them in these Virago editions as well. This second memoir particularly focuses on her experiences of poverty as an adult, the cruelty she experiences and the discrimination she experiences, the jobs that she has in shops and in nightclubs, her experiences of narcotics and turning to prostitution, and I found that part of her life really fascinating to read more about. That's a topic that I do have a lot of interest in, but something so grounded in someone's real life experience in that particular time and place of history, I found really fascinating to have that kind of first-hand account of how she found her experiences. Because she is such a skilled writer, and I found this with Jackie Kay's memoir as well, it almost feels like you're reading fiction because it's so kind of superbly written on like a line level. It feels like everything is paced perfectly. But then you end up remembering that this is her actual lived experience and her life story, and I think to tell her life story in such a way that showcases her mastery of storytelling, I just thought was absolutely fantastic. So yes, would definitely recommend. One that I'm less sure I would recommend is Where I'm Reading From by Tim Parks. Now, perhaps I went into this book with slightly skewed expectations. I thought it would be a bit more kind of light-hearted than it is. This is a collection of essays about our experiences as readers and how we approach reading and literature's place in wider society. I thought it would maybe like touch on some slightly more frivolous aspects of our reading lives, whereas I think this is much more focused on a kind of literary sphere perspective. A lot of what he's talking about would be considered quite, I guess, highbrow considerations in our approaches to literature. When I read nonfiction about a particular topic, I often find it a really enriching experience when an author is able to draw on components of their own life to illustrate a wider point that they are making about society as a whole. But when the author interjected with parts of his own life, I actually found it really irritating. Like, how many times did he need to mention that he lives in Italy? I think I would have got a lot more value out of this book when I was at university. So when I was thinking about these kinds of ideas, like what is a novel, what is the role of an author, and I think there's actually a lot in here that I would have found of value perhaps incorporating into essays, but it wasn't exactly the kind of cozy bookish non-fiction book that I was anticipating. Next up, I have The Mixer by Michael Cox. I really enjoyed this book. Now, it's not something I would give a particularly wide-ranging recommendation for. It's a book that is all about kind of football tactics, formations, systems of play, the particular important figures that brought in new ways of thinking about how you approach a game of football, whether that is players or managers, and it's all about the English Premier League. So in many ways, it's also a history of the Premier League, but through that perspective of the evolving methods of tactics. I found it extremely enjoyable. If you are someone that is interested in football as well, I would highly recommend this. Michael Cox is someone who I've read a lot of his journalism before. I've listened to him on a lot of podcasts, but I hadn't got around to reading his book yet, and I'm so glad that I now have. I really loved this, and if you are a football fan, then I would definitely recommend. And finally, for the nonfiction, I have a children's nonfiction book. This is Breaking News by Nick Sheridan. This is a super fun book that is illustrated throughout and so funny, that is all about teaching kids how to tell what is real from what is rubbish with regards to the news cycle. So they are getting news from lots of different places, whether that is TV or radio, from print media, from social media and their phones. And this book is about teaching kids how to critically critically look at the news they're receiving and analyze it and see, is there any bias in this? Is this actually an entirely fabricated story, or is there legitimacy to it? Nick also shows readers what it is like to be a journalist, what different kinds of journalists there are, what different kinds of reporters or news anchors there are, what their different responsibilities are, what their typical working day might be like, and the things that he and other journalists are always bearing in mind when they are approaching a story. Illustrations are absolutely fantastic, as I said, and the writing is so genuinely funny. Like, I was sat there giggling to myself when I was reading this, so I can only imagine what a child would be like reading this. And equally, I don't think Nick shies away from the fact that the news can be difficult. It can often be about really harrowing subjects. And while he doesn't shy away from that, he also presents that in a way that is friendly for a child audience and encourages them to speak to an adult in their life if they find something confusing or distressing, if they have questions. If you have one of those kids in your lives that are just so curious about the world, that are always asking why this, why that, then I think this would be a fantastic book for them to read. I also have 2 YA books, starting with Nigel Work by Deirdre Sullivan. Deirdre Sullivan is of course one of my favourite writers. I read a bunch of her books, and Nigel Work was a really fascinating read. I would say when it comes to teen fiction, Deirdre Sullivan is definitely on the older end and definitely the more literary end. This writing is quite poetic, it can be quite flowery at points, it can be quite abstract at points. I didn't have a particularly firm grip on what this book was about going into it. I thought it was something to do with self-harm, maybe something to do with eating disorders, and I wasn't quite sure exactly what it was going to be about. And those things are in the book. They are also one of the many manifestations of a melting pot of traumas that our teen character is dealing with in this book. It's a novel about terrible neglect and abuse from those who are meant to be caring for you. It's a book about a young girl who is violated and her trying to understand her own trauma. And through that process, I think it means that there feels like there's a huge amount of distance between you and the main character, and I understand why there is. For much of the book, I couldn't quite get to grips with what was going on, and I think that's partially because of Deirdre Sullivan's writing style, but I also think it's really apt for the story that she's telling. We don't come to terms with our trauma or recognize or realize the traumas that we've been through in a linear way, in a way that makes step-by-step sense. It is a bit muddled up. There are things that come back to us in flashes. There are brief moments where we have clarity on a situation that prior to that moment was entirely unclear. So I think Deirdre Sullivan's writing style really lends itself to that process of realizing your trauma and realizing how to move on from it. This is definitely a brutal book. I wouldn't recommend reading it if you are someone who thinks you will be triggered by any of those kinds of topics, or you're not feeling in a particularly strong place to read about these topics, but it's a really fantastic and accomplished novel, I think. But if you are looking for something that is very clear in terms of what is happening in the plot, something that you can really get to grips with what is happening, this may not be the one for you. I also read Blackout, which is by lots of different authors. So we have Danielle Clayton, Nick Stone, Tiffany D. Jackson, Nicola Yoon, Angie Thomas, and Ashley Woodfolk. All of these stories are set in the same night when there is a blackout in New York City, and it is about 13 different teenagers and what they get up to on that night. I read this book really quickly, and I think perhaps too quickly, because I'm not sure all of the stories have properly stayed with me. I think I could do with sitting down and rereading some of them. But there is actually one story that stayed with me a lot more than the others, and that's a story that we come back to. So it's told in several different parts. It's Tiffany D. Jackson's story, and it's called The Long Walk, and it's split up into different acts. So rather than it being told in one chunk like the other stories are, The Long Walk is split up across the entirety of the book. And I think because we were coming back to those characters more, I felt a lot more investment in their story. And perhaps that's why some of the other stories haven't stayed with me so much, because I was really trying to get back to the story that I was really enjoying. But there was something just so wholesome about watching these different characters, watching these different teenagers just experience this night together, the different nuances and different perspectives in their lives, the different relationships they have with one another, how they all approach their individual love stories differently. Very cute book, and I would recommend if you want those kinds of like cozy, fuzzy teen romance feels. I also read Calamitous by VJ Spencer. This is a self-published book, and the author is one of my best friends. This is the second book in her trilogy that starts with Clandestine. I read and reviewed Clandestine last year, and I thought it was a really impressive first book in a series. And it's so fantastic to see how the author's writing style has progressed, how they have developed their writing on on a line level, but also their understanding of their characters, of what the world that they are writing about is. It's kind of difficult to talk about this book without spoiling the first book, so a sort of overview of the first book. In this dystopian world, when you reach 18 years old, you are sent off to clandestine, where you are essentially trained to be a soldier. Everything about your life is controlled and regimented, and we follow a group of characters who have the seeds of questioning planted. They are beginning to question what the world was like before this regime was brought in, whether this status quo is actually just or moral. They are beginning to question why they are being trained to become soldiers. And without spoiling the ending of the first book, in this second book we are following them on this journey of activism and of rebellion even further. There are new characters brought in who show different aspects of this world. They show different aspects of how the oppressive regime that they are living under is impacting people's lives in terribly dangerous ways. I'm very excited for the third book in this trilogy, to see how it all ends up and to see who survives. To finish things up, I finally finished Beautiful World, Where Are You by Sally Rooney. What more can I say about this book that people haven't already said? I feel very late to the party about this one. Everyone had their hot take on it. Mine's a lukewarm take. This book is mainly focused on the friendship between Alice and Eileen, who do much of their correspondence throughout the novel in the form of letters or emails. And on the side of the correspondence between these two girls and us exploring the friendship between them, they also both have romantic, sexual-ish relationships, situationships with these extremely boring men. Alice is a novelist, and it's impossible not to draw parallels between Alice's life and Sally Rooney's life, which is always something that I'm really reluctant to do, especially with writing from women. But it feels like Sally Rooney is leaning into all of the things that have been put to her about her own novels, that, you know, they must be about her own life, so she's leaning into that. I think another criticism that is often targeted towards Sally Rooney is that her writing or her characters are self-indulgent, and I think in this book she's leaning into that criticism. And a lot of this book is actually a scathing critique on the publishing industry. I think particularly the literary publishing industry, how we think about the author, how we promote books, about PR and marketing and money. I think this book is an interesting piece. I'm not sure I think it's a good novel, because a lot of the correspondence and emails feel like non-fiction pieces that are essentially a platform for Sally Rooney to share her opinions. I honestly really feel like Sally Rooney is essentially trolling the publishing industry, as I said, particularly the literary publishing industry, with this book. It feels like she's taking the piss out of it. And I would be interested to hear someone's perspective on this who isn't necessarily in a kind of bookish literary publishing sphere. I would love to hear a perspective on this book that is someone who maybe discovered Sally Rooney through watching normal people, because I think to fully understand this novel it needs to be fully put in the context of everything that has happened to Sally Rooney in the past 2 or 3 years. And yes, I think novels should be put in their contexts, but equally I think they should be able to stand independently as a story. And I think to fully appreciate what Sally is doing in this book, you do need to put it in context. A couple of other things to note about this novel is the character Felix, who, yes, I've said is a very boring man, but he is so accurately crafted. So Felix is Alice's, the novelist's, her situationship stroke relationship throughout this book. He is very much not in this kind of literary publishing sphere whatsoever. And he is so insecure about that, and he masks it with this kind of nonchalance, he doesn't give a fuck, and he almost preempts people judging him. So when he meets people who are in this kind of more literary sphere, or in a more, I would say even kind of corporate sphere in terms of their careers, he preempts those people judging him, and it's like he gets there first, so he has the upper hand, when really these people had no judgment about him whatsoever. And Sally Rooney has captured his character so perfectly. My final note on this book is that I hated the ending. I don't want to spoil the ending for anyone, but just really pulled me out of the story. I didn't understand why it pulled us out like that. I don't understand why it couldn't just end without acknowledging what it acknowledges. But I digress. I thought this book was very good, which is not a bad review at all. Very good is very good. above average. So there we have it. These are the books that I read in November. They will all be linked down below in the description if you want to find out more about them. If you have read any of these books and want to share your thoughts on them, do leave me a comment down below. Or if you don't have anything in particular to say, leave me your favorite pink emoji so that I know that you're here. I would tell you what number my TBR is at, but like, honestly, what's the point? If you watched my last haul, you know I've fucked it. My plan of having my TBR below 100 books by the end of the year is not gonna happen. I did at one point just get below 100 books and then quickly just acquired more books. And hey, guess what? It was my birthday and this happened. You can't see all of this, but you will see all of it in a haul. So basically, lads, I've fucked it. I fucked it. My TBR stands at this number. Deal with it. Anyways, that's it for me today. I hope you guys are doing well, and I will speak to you in my next video where I will be sharing this with you.